Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a soldier flown directly into combat by helicopter? Well, today you're going to find out how their job really looked and why it was much scarier than it seems in the movies. Let's begin. During the Korean War, the US was impressed by the effectiveness of helicopters. Even though they weren't the safest way to transport people, they showed remarkable potential in wars without clear front lines, where the terrain made it impossible to use the military in the traditional way. The Vietnam War proved this, as the US deployed around 12,000 helicopters, nearly half of which were destroyed during the conflict. However, air mobility would become a new revolutionary tactic that, for the first time, combined helicopters and infantry in direct battle. Its first large-scale test came during Operation Chopper, when American CH-21 Shawnee helicopters were used to drop over 1,000 ARVN paratroopers in an attack on Viet Cong positions near Saigon. They managed to completely surprise the enemy by attacking from an unexpected direction and successfully completed the mission. Since in the Vietnam War roads were difficult, often impassable for heavy vehicles and prone to ambush, helicopters took on the role of transporting troops and providing them with direct fire support. However, the Vietnamese would quickly understand this new tactic and develop countermeasures that would make their job extremely dangerous. Even before Vietnam, the experimental 11th Air Assault Division was formed with the idea of introducing this new tactic from the start. Although it had many flaws for fighting traditionally against whole armies, it was ideal for combating the guerrilla formations that would characterize the Vietnam War. Shortly afterward, the well-known 1st Cavalry was recreated with recruits from the 11th Air Assault Division and immediately sent to Vietnam. The 1st Cavalry Division was originally formed back in the 1920s as a traditional horse cavalry unit. It fought all through World War II and later Korean War as infantry, but kept its historic name, and when the Vietnam War began, it was no different. Only this time, instead of horses, they were riding helicopters, officially designated as the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile. Using this tactic, soldiers no longer had to carry heavy packs for weeks and hike for miles to reach their destination. They didn't even have to jump out like paratroopers. Instead, they arrived fresh and ready, delivered straight to the fight by helicopter. Soon, many other units began serving as air mobile infantry, even though they were not originally formed for this purpose. The famous airborne divisions, 173rd and the 101st, instead of jumping with parachutes, they were now also delivered into battle by helicopter, and soon standard infantry units as well. The core of the air mobile tactic is the air assault, which allowed soldiers to bypass dense jungles, rivers, and mountains and land directly in enemy-held territory, hoping to catch them off guard. In practice, however, it was far from safe and simple. Both the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong quickly adapted to these new methods and became experts at using traps and ambushes. So what did a typical air assault look like? UH-1 Huey helicopters flying in tight formation would carry a squad of 10 to 12 soldiers, packed tightly in open bays with their legs often dangling outside. If you wonder whether someone could fall out, the answer is yes, and it happened for various reasons. Alongside them, CH-47 Chinooks might carry extra supplies or even artillery, while armed Hueys and later AH-1 Cobra gunships provided covering fire and cleared the landing zone. First, the gunships would sweep the landing zone with machine guns, miniguns, rockets, and grenades. This would also help to activate hidden booby traps or mines. Sometimes they would even set up a fake landing zone and then land somewhere else to trick the enemy. Next, the transport helicopters rapidly approached the LZ one after the other, landing only briefly so the infantry could jump off before taking off again while the next helicopter took its place. Very often this happened under heavy enemy fire, so-called hot LZs, one of the scariest experiences possible. A veteran pilot recalled he needed all the strength in the world to push the joystick down and lower his helicopter into the cloud of machine gun tracers below. During landing, both helicopters and soldiers were extremely exposed and vulnerable to small arms fire, let alone heavier weapons, and catastrophic outcomes were not rare. Many choppers were shot down before they could even deploy their infantry or while trying to extract them. Because helicopters were sometimes piloted by very young and inexperienced pilots, some only 18 years old, accidents and collisions were common. Flying in tight formations under immense pressure, they could fly in each other's rotors and propellers, causing severe damage or crashes. The enemy quickly learned how to lure Americans into ambushes or predict where they would land. Viet Cong would be laying in wait around landing zones with machine guns, recoilless rifles, and anti-aircraft weapons. Their .51 caliber machine guns were especially lethal to helicopters. A favorite strategy was to lure American troops into mined areas and prepared crossfire zones where anti-aircraft guns were positioned. They knew exactly which helicopters to target and when, to disrupt the Americans as much as possible. They studied US tactics and could often predict the next steps, such as the arrival of resupply or medevac choppers. Still, it is said that 9 times out of 10, helicopters would land when needed, no matter the conditions. Cobra gunships had significantly longer hover time than Hueys, so they would arrive first to prepare the landing zone, cover and support the landing, and even stay for a while to support soldiers on the ground before needing to refuel and rearm. However, they were also vulnerable to enemy fire, especially during low-flying gun runs to provide close support. And they were an even bigger target because the enemy knew how dangerous their firepower was. They were also followed by several helicopters designated for medevac, the famous dust-offs, manned by some of the bravest crews, credited with saving thousands of lives. The entire concept was based on extreme speed and coordination, leaving no room for error. All participants were instructed never to hesitate and to make and carry out decisions, even if they were wrong, because waiting almost always meant certain death or a failed mission. After landing, the soldiers would disembark as quickly as possible and run for cover to establish a perimeter and defense. Many times they were delivered literally straight into combat. If they were lucky enough to avoid traps, they would then proceed with their mission, depending on their specific objective. In the field, soldiers removed their shiny insignias loved by enemy snipers, and leaders stayed close but not right beside the radio men, as officers and radio men were the first to be targeted along with M60 gunners. Because of that, they always tried to keep a formation where a single RPG, grenade or machine gun burst couldn't take out all the most important people at once. The US Army constantly experimented with new and creative ways to use helicopters. Even in places where they couldn't land, they could hover overhead so that soldiers could dismount by ropes or special ladders. This made it possible to insert troops almost anywhere, especially in high mountain regions where the Viet Cong dug in, expecting the enemy to come from lower ground. Another tactic was diversionary landings and extractions. Helicopters would drop off troops and later pick them up, but small groups of soldiers would remain behind, hidden in ambush patrols. The enemy often came to investigate after the Americans had left, so they would fall into an ambush. Night landings were also used sometimes, though they were less common because of the higher risks involved. As an example of how badly things could go during air mobile operations, we can look at the Battle of LZ Albany, one of the deadliest and most chaotic engagements of the Vietnam War. It was part of the larger Ia Drang campaign. After intense fighting at LZ X-Ray, 2 battalions of the 7th Cavalry Regiment began a tactical march toward new landing zones to regroup and prepare for evacuation. Their columns stretched out in a 550-yard line as it moved through dense jungle and tall elephant grass. The soldiers were exhausted, having gone 60 hours without sleep, fighting and marching. While trying to reach the extraction point, the reconnaissance platoon stumbled upon the enemy by surprise, capturing 2 of them, likely part of an enemy recon team. The scouts also found sandal footprints, bamboo arrows pointing directions, and rice grains in the jungle, which creeped them out. The column was ordered to halt and prepare flank defense, but they did not realize they were just 200 yards away from a heavily fortified enemy headquarters. The worn-out troops were sitting in chest-high grass, stretched out in the open, unaware that around a corner were hundreds of enemy fighters. About an hour after capturing those soldiers, enemy troops launched a coordinated L-shaped ambush, hitting the front and side of the American column. They poured out of the jungle by the hundreds, engaging in hand-to-hand combat and overwhelming the disoriented Americans. They split the column into isolated pockets, and some companies were overrun and wiped out within minutes. As the battle raged, US helicopters tried to help the ambushed soldiers. They flew into heavy fire trying to evacuate them, and several were shot down immediately. Some landed to pick up troops but were damaged in the field and could not take off again. The Battle of Ia Drang as a whole saw 16 helicopters destroyed and more than 125 damaged, with LZ Albany accounting for a large part of them. Close air support arrived with A-1E Sky Raiders dropping napalm, but the US and NVA soldiers were so close together that the airstrikes caused indiscriminate casualties on both sides. Fighting continued in chaos until nightfall, when some reinforcements managed to land and secure a perimeter around the survivors. They were extracted under heavy fire, and by the end of the day, the 2nd Battalion had suffered catastrophic losses of 155 men dead or missing, and around 130 wounded.